Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pacific Bridge Medical's webcast on China medical regulatory updates, devices, IVDs, and more. Questions can be submitted during the presentation via the chat function on your screen. They will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Today's speaker is Ames Gross, President of Pacific Bridge Medical. Mr. Gross, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And thanks everybody for attending our webcast today. We hope you'll find it informative. And as the lady just mentioned, we will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webcast. So I want to start the presentation on page 2. And, the main issue here is why is everybody interested in the Chinese medical device market? Well, you can see here the sizes of the medical device markets around the world. Obviously, U.S. is number 1. Currently, Japan is number 2, and China is number 3. But the fact of the matter is the growth in China is so high that the size of the Chinese medical device market should surpass the size of the Japanese medical device market probably in about 5 years. So that's why people are excited about China, and more people are getting wealthier in China so they can afford better health care, more drugs, and more Western devices. So the size of the market's tremendous. It's growing very quickly still, and that's why people are excited. Here's another illustration of the growth, and you can see here on the 3 curves. So one of the curves is at like a 13% year growth, and one of the curves is about 20% growth. Basically, this is just another illustration of what we said on the previous slide. Okay, I think people are familiar in China that normally there's 3 agents, but right now the legal agent and the after-sales agent have been combined together as an agent in China. And of course, the agent must be a registered entity in China to perform the following services. So the agents are doing, the communicating between the client, the foreign manufacturers and the relative administrative departments of the China Health Authority or the CFDA. They're supposed to truthfully and accurately convey the Chinese requirements and technical requirements to the foreign manufacturers, assist with product recalls if and when they happen in China, and then, of course, report that to the relevant administration at the CFDA, and these intermediary type functions to make sure your product is registered and regulated correctly in China, and that if it's not, they have a window to be in touch with you. And then on the bottom there, you can see the registration agent is the second agent now. It used to be the third agent must be a registered entity in China. So basically, foreign companies that don't have some kind of a distributor or third-party registration agent in China cannot apply for product registration directly in China. I think everybody on the phone is familiar with the CFDA, basically similar as the U.S. FDA, and also the other agency to keep in mind would be the AQSIQ, which conducts mandatory safety registration, certification, and inspection, but they only do this on certain devices, so it's not for everybody. This is a recent organization chart for the approval of devices. You can see on the top we have the pre-market approval, and then on the bottom we have the post-market supervision. And this is how the CFDA is organized today. Now, I think most people attended the webcast today because they've heard that there's a lot of new regulations in China, and the question is what the regulations are, what are those specific regulations, and how will they affect your business there, and how are such new rules and regulations interpreted. So this just gives you a list of the new laws that were released on October 1st, 2014. And then, of course, the issue is to what extent these new regulations are enforced in China. So the main regulatory changes are discussed here in slide 8. And as you can see, the first thing is the new CFDA regulations. 2014 regulatory edition is significantly longer than the previous version of 2000, 8 chapters as opposed to 6 chapters and 80 articles compared to 48 articles. For Class 1 products, Class 1 medical device products in China today, you need to do a filing notification instead of a registration application. So it's making it easier in some ways for Class 1 products to be registered in China, or not registered, but notified in China. But of course, the number of documents required for the Class 1 medical device notification in China has gone up significantly too. More and more local clinical trials are required for approval of Class 2 and 3 devices. 5 years ago, if you had a Class 2 or Class 3 medical device and you had good foreign data, Europe, U.S., Australia, Canada, you normally would not have to repeat and do local clinical studies in China. But going forward for Class 2 and Class 3 devices, that's not going to be the situation. On the next bullet point, some Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices will be exempt from local clinical trials. So that's good for some people. Of course, the categories there are limited. When you get a product registration license, it's been extended now to 5 years from 4 years. So it gives you an extra year before you have to re-register. The biocompatibility data is still required for submission as part of the research data. However, this does not require retesting in China. The time window for submitting supplementary documents is increased from 60 to 365 days, but extensions beyond that are no longer allowed. And there may be QMS audits for some product registrations. So I think most of the people on the line today are familiar with the classification system in China. It follows very closely to the U.S. FDA classification system. Most of the time, if you have a Class 2 product in the U.S., it'll be a Class 2 product in China. There are exceptions, obviously, but in general, they're following Class 1, 2, and 3. The question comes, if you're not sure which class it is, what you can do to firm up the classification as you're doing your application, and we'll speak about that next. So if you have an innovative product or you have a combination drug device product, getting an official CFDA classification can be very helpful. However, it can take a little while for the classification process to take place, anywhere from 3 to 12 months. And in the new 2014 regulations from October last year, the CFDA provides an alternative pathway for products whose classification is not very clear in China. So for products where the classification is not very clear, if the foreign manufacturer does not want to wait, let's say, for the CFDA official classification designation, the foreign manufacturer can file the registration application right away as a Class 3 medical device and not wait for a classification decision. But basically, the CFDA will appoint the proper classification for the product after they complete their initial technical review. Okay, here on the next slide, medical device classification. So these are some of the draft classification rules that were announced. So kits containing multiple devices will be classified per the highest device. So if you have one Class 3 product in a kit where the other products are all Class 1, the kit will be classified as a Class 3 device. Standalone software will be in the same classification as the device it works with. So if the device where the software is a Class 3, then the software will be Class 3 too as a standalone software. There's a new category for IVDs, which is separate from medical devices. And some categories have changed on the fifth bullet point there, where medical dressings, for example, are now classified as functional or ordinary medical dressings, whereas in the past they were just called medical dressings. So this gives you a visual picture of the medical device classification catalog, and this is both in Chinese and English, and you can see the subcategory, the product type, and then examples of those products, and then the specific classification on the right-hand side. Okay, so then here on the product technical specifications. So according to the 2014 new regulations, the previous required YZB product standards are replaced by product technical specifications. So in the past, when you're doing a registration in China, you'd want to know what the standard is. But again, this has been replaced now by the product technical specifications. So the product technical specifications are similar to the past product standards, and of course, they're a very important part of the registration process. But keep in mind, since the product technical specifications are not reviewed by the China Medical Device Evaluation Center before your testing, the type testing is done on the company's own draft for the product technical specifications. And keep in mind, with regard to these product technical specifications, if any of, let's say, the key performance and safety requirements are missing or not properly reported in the company's own draft, the CFDA may request that the foreign company to revise and retest according to the revised version. Again, once the type testing is complete, the product technical specifications cannot be revised. So if you try to revise the technical specifications after the type testing, this may lead to additional testing of your product. And then also any revision on this technical specification file after registration approval requires a supplement application. So what you want to do is make sure that all the information is correct and supported by the legal documents the first time around. Okay, so if there's technical revision on your file, that may lead to additional local testing in China. So the product technical specifications should do the following: list all the required performance specifications and safety specifications for the finished product. So keep in mind that if these specification items comply with the Chinese standards or the national standards, industry standards, or international standards, the requirements of these items cannot be lower than the Chinese or international standards. And then you need to list the testing method for each specification. Generally, the CFDA suggests using methods described in the compiled Chinese or international standards. So if a company's internal method is used, there must be a specific reason that's provided to use the company's internal method. Okay, so then here on the product technical specification, the evaluation and research during the product design development stage is no longer required, and therefore biocompatibility requirements do not need to be included as specification items. We talked about this briefly before, that basically the biocompatibility requirements do not need to be included as specification items with the new product technical specifications. Okay, but in June of 2014, the CFDA also released 120 new medical device industry standards, and all these are recommended standards, not mandatory. And these 120 new standards will still go into effect on July 1st of this year. So as it is before the new regulations, the CFDA will request samples for type testing for Class 2 and Type 3 products. But for Class 1 products, the CFDA will accept a foreign company's foreign report. So because the Class 1 products are now notifications, not registrations. And the testing centers, which can be troublesome at times, will test all the specification items listed in the product technical specifications, which of course is drafted by the company. But a lot of times companies are having problems with the testing centers. There's only 10 national testing centers, and whether the testing center has the know-how or the equipment to test your products correctly is really the issue. So oftentimes companies' product registrations get delayed because their products get delayed in the testing process. And we've seen companies ship over special testing equipment, send technical experts from U.S., Europe to the Chinese testing center to help them with the testing. And so these are the kind of things that are now required more and more to get your testing report. Okay, and you can see on the bottom bullet point, while conducting the test, the CFDA now requests that testing centers provide comments on the company's draft product technical specifications. So as I mentioned, there's 10 national testing centers, and those are listed here. There are also 40 affiliated testing institutes, and as I just mentioned, the biocompatibility is no longer required in the product technical specifications. Therefore, if the company already has a foreign report, testing in China on, let's say, ISO 10993 will not be required. So again, therefore, if the company already has a foreign report, testing in China on the ISO 10993 is not required. And again, the ISO 10993 is equivalent to the GB/T 16886. Now, this chart basically shows you, it's not a new chart, this is nothing new, but you can see here on the right side on the Class 1, so if you have a Class 1 product that's imported device, you only have to do the notification with the national CFDA. You don't have to register with the CFDA. And if you're making a locally made Class 1 product, you normally just have to get the notification from the city in which the manufacturing facility is located. So the CFDA in that specific Chinese city. So again, though, on Class 2 and Class 3 products, for Class 3 products imported or locally made, they have to be approved by the national CFDA. So if you're making a locally made Class 3 products, you still need to go to the national CFDA. And then for Class 2 products that are imported, you'd go to the national CFDA, but if you're making locally made Class 2 products, they can be approved by the provincial CFDA. So the reason this is all important to know is that, normally the provincial CFDAs are easier to get approval from than the national CFDA. So to a certain extent, Class 2 products that are locally made have an advantage over Class 2 products that are imported in China, because the Class 2 products that are exported to China or imported into China need to be approved by the national CFDA, and their locally made Class 2 products can be approved by the provincial CFDA. So, we see more and more companies that are exporting Class 3 and Class 2 products to China, but now if they make their product in China, the Class 2 product made in China gets approved by the provincial CFDA, not the national CFDA. So things to keep in mind, whether you're going to export only or you're going to make products locally, etc. So as I mentioned already, Class 1 devices will no longer require registration, only filing a notification application with the CFDA. But keep in mind that for the notification application, there are more documents required for the Class 1 notification now than were required for the Class 1 registration. So the good news is you don't have to get a registration, you just do a notification. But the bad news is the number of documents needed to get a Class 1 notification is a lot higher than before. And basically, when you submit your Class 1 dossier or your application to the CFDA, you have to hand deliver it actually in Beijing, and then they're going to review it. Sometimes they can review it on the spot, and sometimes they can review it and ask questions. So they're really reviewing it to make sure of the accuracy of the documents you submitted and that all the names, model numbers, et cetera, are all matching. And if they find some discrepancy in that, they'll ask you to go back and change some documents or correct some discrepancies. So it's not, if everything is totally in order, yes, you could get the notification application submitted for a Class 1 product. They go through the checklist of the documents, everything looks great, and then your product would be notified. But it's more likely when they're in that during the notification application that they'll still come back and ask you some questions, which you have to redo the documents and resubmit, 1 week or 2 weeks later. So again, on the bottom here, the CFDA reviews more strictly on the format of Class 1 documents. So again, notification, not registration, but more complicated notification than before. So for Class 1 devices, this basic slide basically outlines the document requirements So you can see here that the applicant should provide all the documents in Chinese as well as in English, and normally you have to submit the original copy or a notified copy of these documents. So again, this is the document requirements for a Class 1 notification in China today. Now, the registration time frame for Class 2 and 3 devices in China has greatly expanded. So whereas maybe 3 years ago you could get a Class 2 product registered within, let's say, 10 to 12 months, to get a Class 2 product registered in China now can take anywhere from, let's say, 12 to 18 months. And a Class 3 product to be registered in China could take anywhere, I'd say, from 18 to 30 months. And, of course, if you have to do a local clinical study, you may have to add a year for that, too. So this is a schematic drawing of what has to happen before the registration application is submitted, and the timing there and the timing of events. And then on the next slide is the tasks that occur after the registration application is submitted and the approximate timeframes for the CMDE review, 60 to 90 days, etc. Supplemental dossier preparation, maximum 1 year. We talked about that briefly. But what I'd say is that more and more foreign companies find that their device registrations in China can drag on forever. The testing could be a big roadblock, but going through this maze of CFDA timing requirements still is very difficult. So most companies are fairly frustrated today in getting their Class 2 and Class 3 products registered in China. Now, as far as the registration requirements for a Class 2 or Class 3 document, there's a total of 12 documents, 9 legal documents, 2 technical documents, and then, of course, the testing report is crucial from the Certified Testing Center, one of the national testing centers we talked about before. Now, what we've seen actually for the testing centers is some companies will take their product to be tested at one of the centers, but that center doesn't specialize in cardiology, so by taking your product to the wrong testing center, you have a huge delay in getting your testing report. So it's very important that companies really do their homework about each testing national testing center, the 10 national testing centers, before they decide which testing center they want to send their products to be tested. And obviously, if you make a mistake and you send a cardio product to a testing center that has no cardio capacities or knowledge, it's going to delay the registration. So here again is sort of a schematic look at the documents that are required for people that have looked at the Chinese documents, and this is for product registration for imported Class 2 products. And you can see on the left, it's both in English and Chinese, and the kind of information that we were talking about on the previous slide. And then on slide 25, basically the same kind of information, just to give you a sense of what the slide looks like. So on the next slide, basically on, 25 is the second slide of what the form looks like. On the next slide, the supplementary review process. So normally after the technical review by the CFDA, they will request further information, and a supplemental notice will be issued after the initial technical review. So most people that are doing Class 2 and 3 registrations now will get a supplemental notice. It's unlikely that you wouldn't get that. And then again, based on the supplementary notice, you may have to do some additional testing on your product. But as of 2014, as we talked about before, the time to respond to the supplementary documents or whatever has been extended from 60 days to 365 days. So there's a lot more time now to get back to the CFDA when they have a supplementary notice. But, keep in mind that after the 365 days has expired, the company cannot submit the full supplement dossier according to the supplemental notice because the application will be rejected if you don't respond within the 365 days. And the extension time for the supplement dossier preparation time is no longer allowed. So the extension for the supplemental dossier preparation time is no longer allowed if you don't respond to the CFDA within the 365 days. And then keep in mind, too, that although it's not written in the regulations, there is now a maximum of 2 rounds of supplementary reviews. And if the issues are not resolved in the 2 rounds of supplementary reviews, the CFDA reviewer can propose the rejection of the application. So again, it's not in stone or written anywhere, but normally there's a maximum of 2 rounds of supplementary review, and if the issues are not resolved within that period of time, the reviewer can propose to reject the application because it's just going back and forth too much. So most companies are not seeing more than 2 rounds of supplementary reviews these days. Now, obviously, the big trigger point in China for the registration is more Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices are going to have local clinical studies done in China for the product approval. As I mentioned earlier, 5 years ago, if you had some good foreign data on a Class 2 or 3 device and you wanted to register in China, you wouldn't have to do any local clinical studies for the most part. But now there's more and more local clinical trials that are required, hence giving a boom to the medical device CRO or clinical trial groups that do the clinical trials. And there is a list of exemption, and these are some of the criteria that would happen for it to be on the exemption list for a local clinical study. Exemptions will apply if the manufacturing process mature, the safety and efficacy can be proved by non-clinical evaluations, the safety and efficacy improved via clinical trials or data from similar products. So there could be some exceptions to doing local clinical studies. These exemption rules 1, 2, and 3 are fairly general, so it's still going to be more on a case-by-case basis, and you're going to have to prove to the CFDA that your product fits into one of these exemptions. And then also, you can see here on the bottom that manufacturers that are applying for registration of one of these now exempted medical devices, you basically have to submit a written application to the CFDA to receive an exemption from undertaking local clinical trials in China today. So we're not going to go through all the exempted products today during the webcast, but basically if you look at these regulations, you can see which Class 2 and which Class 3 products are exempted from doing local clinical trials in China. So obviously, if you have a Class 2 or 3 device, you want to check closely to see if you'd fit into one of those exempted areas. And you can see on the second brownish bullet point, a total of 79 categories of Class 3 products are included. So keep in mind too that let's say if the Class 2 or Class 3 medical device is not included in the above notices, number 12 and number 13 above, but let's say the foreign applicant feels that the clinical safety can be drawn on some previous clinical studies or some usage data from, let's say, a similarly marketed product, the applicants can still submit a detailed data analysis report to support their argument and apply for a local clinical trial exemption. So again, even if your device is not on one of the lists above, number 12 and number 13, and you feel strongly that the clinical safety can be proven via a previous clinical study or some usage data from a similarly marketed device in China, the applicant can submit a detailed data analysis report to support their argument that they can still apply for a local clinical trial exemption. Okay, so here, before conducting a Class 2 or 3 clinical device clinical trial, the clinical trial protocol must be approved by the ethics committee of the clinical site. So this is really the same as it's been in the past. It's not a GCP or good clinical practice request. It is a good clinical practice request. It's not a CFDA request. So, and then on notice number 14, so you can see here a batch of Class 3 devices which require CFDA approval of local clinical trials before kicking off the study. And keep in mind that there's a total of 8 categories of high-risk implant products are included in the products that need to have a local clinical study. And for these 8 categories, And for these products in the 8 categories, not only does the clinical protocol need to be reviewed for Class 3 products, other technical files can also be submitted for review, such as, like any preclinical research data or product technical specification data and type testing report too. So again, according to CFDA Notice number 14, for it announces a batch of Class 3 devices which do require CFDA approval of local clinical trials before they can kick off. So in the past, there was not such a big format on what you had to do to kick off a clinical study, but now for Class 3 products there are. And in this number 14 notice, there's about 8 categories of high-risk implant products which are included. So obviously in China they have their own good clinical practice, and the CFDA published a draft revised regulations on medical device clinical trial requirements, and they're trying to make the Chinese GCP to mimic international GCP standards, and they're trying to make the GCP and the local clinical studies more professional, et cetera. If you follow India, you can see that they've had lots of problems with the ethics committees, good clinical practice, et cetera, and the number of clinical trials for drugs and devices in India has decreased dramatically. So according to CFDA Decree number 6, which was announced in June of 2014, it lists the latest requirements on labeling for medical devices entering China. And this CFDA Decree number 6 became effective October 1st, 2014. And so below are the labeling requirements, and you can get some information here as well as on the next page. So we recently had a situation where a company was asking about, so basically the company was sending over devices to China with the English label, English packaging on the device and whatnot, and the products were being held up at customs. So the question was, and so basically what would happen in the past was that the distributor or the importer would put an overlay of the Chinese label over the current English, let's say, on the package, the labeling package for the box of the device. But now we hear sometimes that they're requiring that the Chinese labeling be put on in the country of origin or country of manufacture, because some companies have had a hard time getting the products through customs just with the English labeling that they've been doing historically. So here, the current labeling in the IFU can be used until the registration certificate is no longer valid, so you don't have to change the labels until your registration certificate, now 5 years, is expired. So the above will apply if the registration dossier was submitted before October 1st when the new regulation on the labeling came into effect. Keep in mind that devices that do not comply with the new labeling requirements cannot be imported, and if imported and sold, there can be penalties to the foreign manufacturer for not complying with the new labeling requirements. And in addition to having more details on your labels, there's also going to be an increase in post-marketing surveillance to ensure that the products are safe in the Chinese marketplace. Okay, we mentioned before about the product registration. So if you get a new registration now, it's valid for 5 years, not 4. Obviously, if you're going to submit a renewal for the application, you want to submit your renewal application 6 months before the expiration of the license. And then if the product remains unchanged since your original registration, the CFDA should grant renewal approval before the expiry date. But keep in mind that if the CFDA exceeds the deadline, the license can be considered as an automatic extension too. So if the product remains unchanged, the CFDA should grant the renewal before the expiration date. But if the CFDA exceeds the deadline, the license can be considered as an automatic extension for foreign manufacturers. Now, on the bottom there, you can see, however, if the product has changed since its initial registration or last registration amendment, the company should prepare additional technical files according to requirements under the relevant regulations or the new regulations we're talking about. So for some categories of amendments, the CFDA will request retesting and retype test. So basically doing the type testing again and also doing the technical review again. So the renewal process could be very, very long in those situations. And so what we normally suggest is that you should start the re-registration process more than 1 year in advance, not 6 months in advance, so you can make sure you can get the renewal one time. So here on Decree number 4 to October 1, 2014, if there's been any change incurred in the registration approval, a registration amendment is required. And if the amendment is approved, the license expiring on the date of the initial product registration will remain the same. So if the changes are categorized as notification amendment, the CFDA will conduct a quick review and issue amended approval documents within 10 business days. So this would apply to things like if you change the legal manufacturer's name or address, or let's say you change the name of the agent in China, those kind of situations. And then if changes are categorized as permission amendments, the CFDA will conduct a technical review regarding the changed technical files. So this is going to happen if there's a change of product model, composition of the product, or the product structure, let's say, if there's a change in the product technical specifications, or a change of the manufacturing site location, or there's some change in the product for its intended use, then you're going to look at the situation of the permission amendments. I think most people on the phone know that the product must be registered in the country of origin. So if it's a U.S. manufacturer, the product's not approved in the U.S., you don't have FDA approval, then obviously you can't register the product in China. So a lot of U.S. companies, for example, might set up some kind of mock office in Europe in which they can get the CE mark, the mock office being some semi-manufacturing in Europe, so then they can get a CE mark, which is almost always a lot easier than the FDA approval. And then once you have the CE mark, even though the U.S. company's product is not approved in the U.S., they can apply for the China registration using their CE mark and claiming they have some kind of manufacturing or finishing operation in Europe. And sometimes this is a way to get around the country of origin regulations. So over the past year, the CFDA has been asking for increased information about raw materials used in medical devices. I know some device companies are asking their suppliers for more information, and oftentimes the raw material suppliers don't want to give this information, which puts you in a catch-22 situation. But obviously working with your suppliers is crucial for successful registration in China. But again, on the supplier standpoint, how much information do they want to provide before they find there's a Chinese company making the same raw materials competing with their company? So this can be a tough issue as far as getting information. Now we're going to talk a little about IVD product registration. As I mentioned, under the new regulations, the IVDs are regulated totally separately from the medical device regulations. So most IVD products are registered as devices, and only a few IVDs are regulated as drugs. And the IVD products under the medical device category must conform to order number 650, which again became effective on October 1st when most of these regulations were implemented in China. And all previous 2007 versions of IVD product registration regulations have now been replaced with the new versions that we're going to talk about. And again, these new IVD regulations became effective October 1st, 2014. And these would include things like the CFDA Decree number 5 for IVD registration. There's a new notice for CFDA 43 and 16 and 17 about IV registration dossier requirements, clinical trial requirements for IVDs, and labeling for IVDs. And so we're going to go through a few of those things for IVDs right now. So again, similar to the medical devices, the Class 1 IVDs do a filing of notification. There's not an approval process. And still, the Class 2 and 3 IVD registration process are fairly similar to the Class 2 and 3 medical devices with some nuances. So this gives you a time chart here of the time frame for imported Class 2 and Class 3 IVDs, which you can compare to the time frame and the flow charts we had earlier about medical devices. And again, the first step here on the first slide is before the registration application is submitted, and on the next slide, the timetable here is for the tasks that are after the registration application is submitted. So you can see how your product is going to move through the CFDA if you have a Class 2 or Class 3 IVD product. So just like devices, IVDs to get approval in China will need sample testing, but the type testing requirements for imported IVDs follow the same requirements as medical devices. As we know, I mentioned, so Class 1s are just notified. Class 1 IVDs are just notification, no registration, so they no longer need type testing in China. And for Class 2 and Class 3 IVDs, the CFDA requested the foreign manufacturer to provide samples and then again to submit them to a certified CFDA testing center for the testing. And keep in mind that Class 2 IVDs require only one batch of samples, but Class 3 IVDs still must provide 3 batches of samples for the testing. So you can see below on the next 2 points that the IVD registration process is still similar to the device process, although somewhat separated from device registration. So for companies that are making IVDs, keep in mind that for clinical trials, so basically right now all Class 2 and Class 3 IVD approvals in China require local clinical studies. So obviously the IVD clinical studies are a lot shorter than a medical device clinical study, but if you have a Class 2 or 3 IVD that's exported to China or imported into China, you still have to follow the rules for local clinical testing of your Class 2 or Class 3 IVD. So the minimum sample size is 1,000. Samples may be collected from healthy volunteers or from patients. And then the main thing here is a comparison study is required to get your Class 2 or 3 IVD approved in China. So similar to a drug, the IVDs require a comparison method to get approval in China. And if you can't do a comparison method for your IVD, it's going to be very difficult to get approval, and there's really no way to calculate the accuracy for the new IVD. And, keep in mind that accuracy for an IVD means there's a lot of complicated calculations based on, certain true-false measures, so, it's complicated. And then also for the comparison study, remember that if there's no gold standard IVD product, the foreign company might need to use the standard clinical diagnostic method as comparison. So basically by doing this, the clinical operation might be more complicated and the cost would be higher. So again, if there's no gold standard IVD product, if you can't compare your IVD in China to another IVD during the clinical study process, the company might need to use the standard clinical diagnostic method as comparison way, and in this way the clinical operation is going to become more complicated and normally more costly. So as I mentioned, for Class 2 and 3 IVDs, almost always now local clinical trials required. But for IVDs, clinical trial exemptions will apply if one of the 3 things here are appropriate. And then on the bottom there, according to the IVD clinical trial regulation, the CFDA sets clear requirements on protocol design, number of clinical sites, sample size, report format, and statistical analysis for new IVD clinical trials in China. So, what I would say here for the IVDs on the registration, the time to register is longer. We already said the Class 1 IVDs are just notified, no local clinical studies. Also for IVDs as devices, the registration is good for 5 years instead of 4 years. The risk analysis report of a technical analysis of the product performance are requested. The separate time has increased just like devices from 60 to 365 days. There are some cases where you can have fast-track IVD approval. And, some local clinical trials are not needed if the IVD is on the exception list. But again, getting on that exception list is not such an easy process. Stem cell products in China is still unclear how they're regulated. And some companies are trying to use their stem cell products with certain doctors and hospitals. But it's normally initiated by the specific Chinese doctor. And mostly these cell therapy type products in China today are used for research programs or research only products for lab use. And of course, if you have a research use only stem cell product, you don't need product registration. But if you are going to use the cell therapy outside of the lab, then you do need to get some registration. But according to the CFDA regulation, keep in mind that research use products, at least in theory, are not supposed to be used on patients for the treatment of a disease or diagnostic purposes. So whether the Chinese doctor, uses the stem cell therapy products in their lab or they use it on patients, it's a little unclear, but in theory they're not supposed to use it on patients. And China is still struggling, I'd say, a lot with stem cells therapy as opposed to Japan, which just came out with the new regulations for a quicker approval for cell and tissue type products in the Japanese marketplace. So some new GMP information in China, good manufacturing practice. So for devices, 2014, and these are some of the appropriate regulations for the GMP. So for domestic manufacturers, CFDA issues a GMP qualification certificate. There are differences between the U.S. FDA and the CFDA requirements. And the CFDA obviously requires foreign manufacturers who export their product to China to conform to certain quality standards. And normally the CFDA accepts conformance to either ISO 13485 or also the U.S. FDA's 21 CFR Part 820 quality system standard. So normally the CFDA accepts conformance to either ISO 13485 or U.S. FDA's 21 CFR Part 820 quality system standards. Adverse reporting in China still not as detailed and specific as the Chinese government would like, but this, the system became more complicated in 2010. And supposedly all manufacturers, distributors, and medical institutions must establish some kind of adverse reporting system. And the following parties are responsible for filing of a report on suspicious medical device adverse event. So adverse events need to be dealt with both the foreign manufacturer, the local Chinese distributor, the local institution or hospital in China, and then also with the CFDA offices for reporting purposes. And then on the next slide here on adverse events, so for serious adverse events, within 20 working days of the initial report, the medical device manufacturer must also file a supplementary report on medical device adverse events, which will provide more details about the adverse event and what happened. So I think these are fairly self-explanatory on the adverse events, but keep in mind that the final revised adverse event reporting system in China will include things. It'll be more comprehensive as far as coverage of a county-level administrative regions, including the requirements for hospitals and distributors. There's more now going to be daily monitoring of medical device adverse events in China. And again, required submission of annual reports and assessments, even if there not been any adverse events. So adverse event reporting is going to be tracked down a lot more in China going forward. You may know if you're registering a product in India and you're trying to re-register your product now, the Indian DCGI is also asking for more post-market surveillance data on the re-registration process too. Recalls of medical devices on the next slide. I think this is fairly self-explanatory. Class 1, 2, and 3. How do you know if the recall is required? So basically, the foreign manufacturer and the distributor must research and report to the CFDA before a potential recall. Device reimbursement in China is still very blurry for most people. You know, if you get a device registered in Japan, there's a formalized system for reimbursement in Japan with codes, you know, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, and F in Japan. So it's very clear what the reimbursement is. Normally, the reimbursement in China is part of the medical procedure, but in some cases, some products can be reimbursed separately. But still a lot of confusion on reimbursement in China, and oftentimes the patients have to pay out of pocket to the doctors to get them to even perform the operation. So this gives you some more information about the local hospitals submitting the coding, pricing at the provincial level. And basically, reimbursable devices are enumerated on a medical device insurance list that is released by the provincial Social Security Bureau at the provincial government. So each province can have their own reimbursement situation, and oftentimes companies have to do a lot of negotiations with those provinces and the provincial Social Security bureaus. This isn't so new, the unannounced CFDA inspections, but basically CFDA inspection teams will consist of, you know, several officers. They could be from the national or the local provincial CFDA offices, and the CFDA team that has an unannounced inspection must prepare some documents ahead of time telling the manufacturer the reason behind the unannounced inspection, and also they have to report on the results of the inspection. So keep that in mind. So now more and more the Chinese government is focusing on the domestic Chinese device business. They're trying to grow their own domestic Chinese medical device business. In a lot of ways, they're very successful. There's so many Class 1 and 2 Chinese imported products that are used in Western hospitals today, it's not even funny. And also the quality of the products coming out of the local Chinese medical device manufacturers has increased. The quality's increased, and they're also doing more and more Class 3 products. So if you look at companies like Lepu or Microport in China, these are billion-dollar medical device companies in China, and they're now making their own drug-eluting stents. And whereas those drug-eluting stents may not be in the U.S. market now, those Chinese drug-eluting stents are competing with, let's say, an American drug-eluting stent manufacturer when you look at the Brazilian market, because the Chinese product may still be 20 to 30% less. 85% is good, but more appropriate for a developing country than some of the high-priced U.S. products. So the CFDA launched a national database for monitoring illegal advertising of drugs, medical devices, etc. And the local CFDA offices are encouraged to strictly interpret the law if they think there's some false advertising, etc. Now, there's been a lot of talk actually in China about fast-track approval. We have a number of companies that call us and they say, we hear there's a new fast-track approval in China, so can we do that instead of going through the regular approval process, which we now know can be lengthy and sort of a difficult process. So basically, on February 7, 2014, the CFDA released these requirements for fast-track approval, and the device must be manufactured in China. You have to have a legal entity in China. And, you know, also the device must have gone through the initial R&D stages, and a prototype must already be developed, of which some of it has to be done in China too. So the fast-track approval is more geared toward products that are made in China, and there's some more information on that in the next couple slides. So let's see, here we go. So overseas applicants should submit their application and data directly to the CFDA. The CFDA's new examination office, if you meet the criteria on the previous page, will look for innovative medical devices, and if you met the criteria, they'll review and make some comments in 40 days. There's also a special form communicating with the CMDE. The China Medical Device Evaluation Center can be used for fast-track approval, and the CMDA will examine the registration and provide administrative approval or no approval on a quicker basis. But the key point is, on the next slide, is what products are eligible to be a fast-track product or an innovative medical device. So there's one of three qualifications that must be met, and you have the patent qualification, the product value qualification, and then the research qualification on the next slide. So basically, again, if your product is made, developed in China, you're going to have a better chance of the fast-track approval than if it's just purely exported. And, of course, if you come up with a new innovative product in China that's made in China, you're always going to worry about the intellectual property rights. On the next slide, the third key point in what's qualified as an innovative medical device besides patent qualification and product value is the research progress. When it says the research process is genuine, who knows what that means? And the research data is complete and traceable. I'm not sure what that means either, because if you come out with an innovative device that's made in the U.S. or whatever, you're not going to let the CFDA see the research data, and how you develop the product. That's not something a foreign company wants to do. But if you are able to get the fast-track approval, you're in a faster processing time, better communication with the CFDA, and there's a specific list of documents for fast-track approval. But then again, the real question is, was this really shorten the application process for your product? And it's very difficult for foreign companies who have designed products overseas to get the fast-track approval. And again, it's really best for foreign companies who have foreign device companies who have large R&D divisions in China, where they can come out with a new product that's made in China, it can get patented in China, and those products are more likely to get fast-track approval. So not that great for just companies looking to export products and getting fast-track approval. So again, there's more and more crackdown about penalties for violations. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. On the next slide, we have some information about the good supply practice, which is new. And then as of last July 2014, good supply practice regulation for medical devices came out. Again, it was effective last October. And for good supply practices for Class 1, 2, and 3 Class 1 and 2, 3 products and Class 1, 2, 3 distributors, the distributors now have a lot of hoops and things they have to jump through to make sure they're involved with the good supply practice. So again, I mean, you find that you have a distributor in China, or you're looking for a new distributor in China. Are you really going to look to see if they're following good supply practices? And are you going to audit their factory according to the new Chinese good supply practices? That would be the question. But in general, the good supply practice in China follows international standards like ISO 9001 or even 1345. The good supply practice uses a risk-based classification system. It applies to the whole distribution chain, including the procurement, inspection, sales, et cetera. So if you're dealing with one distributor and they have sub-distributors, evidently the good supply practice would apply to the sub-distributors too. And even like third-party logistics companies will now need to provide technology and conditions to make sure the products can be traced. And Chinese distributors that are selling Class 3 devices are required to set up some kind of more complex IT management system. But then again, is a foreign Class 3 manufacturer going to do an audit for good supply practices of their distributors in China? Still unclear about that. So then these are some other regulations that have been posted on the CFDA website. Contract manufacturing. So we had some situations where companies call us up, and so basically, let's say a foreign company contracts with a Chinese medical device manufacturer, manufacturer and your own company sells their products in China. So basically, the foreign company is using a subcontractor in China to make your products. But keep in mind, even though it's your product, you're the manufacturer using a subcontract manufacturer in China. The legal manufacturer will be the Chinese manufacturer, not the foreign entity. And in that situation, if you have an office in China, your China office is acting as the distributor locally for China, and again, the legal manufacturer is still the subcontract manufacturer of the Chinese company that you're utilizing to make your product. But let's say also there's another scenario, the foreign device company has its own factory in China and would like to contract another Chinese manufacturer too, so you have a subcontract manufacturer. And so if you have your own foreign device company and a factory in China, and you use other subcontract manufacturers, you can still have the foreign product registered in your name. And the foreign device company's facility in China must meet the Chinese GMP requirements. Okay, we're going to go to the last slide here, which is transfer manufacturing site from one location to another. So we had a lot of calls, people calling up, we make the product in California, we're now going to make it in France. What has to happen? What has to be done? So for a Class 3 device, as I mentioned, the initial registration can take, 20 months plus 12 months for a clinical study, 32 months or more to get a Class 3 product registered in China that requires local clinical studying. But again, if you set up a new factory, a different site, you may need to re-register the product. And so these are different scenarios that people occur when they're looking at changing the manufacturing location in China. So that will conclude my formal comments. We already have a lot of questions, and I'm going to address the questions in a few minutes. If you have questions, please send them in. We also will be sending out an evaluation form for today's webcast. If you liked it, you liked the materials, you didn't like it, what future webcasts you might be interested in us putting on, different Asian countries, or specific topics in the regulatory area. And we really appreciate your attendance. And if you want to learn more about my company, you can see our website. But let me start with the questions because there's already quite a few. So the first question here is, how long does a Class 1 notification take? How long does a Class 1 notification take? Well, I'd say normally it takes about 1 to 2 months to prepare the dossier for the Class 1 notification in China. But once the dossier is assembled and all the documents are in place, the dossier can get notification or approved from the CFDA within 1 day. But again, if there's the CFDA can also come back on your dossier for Class 1 notification and ask for some other documents or changes, which could delay the Class 1 notification to, 2 or 3, 4 weeks. So normally, if everything's in order, it's supposed to be done the same day when you hand the documents in, as I mentioned in the webcast. Next question, is there open access to the device classification catalog as per slide 12 example? Is there open access to the device classification catalog as per slide 12 example? Yeah, so basically the device classification catalog is on the CFDA website in Chinese. I don't believe it's in English, so you can see the classification catalog on the Chinese CFDA, but it's not in English. Okay. Next question. Should the study, I guess that means clinical study, be conducted prior to approval or after approval? If you have a Class 2 or 3 device or IVD that requires local clinical studies, you need to get the clinical studies done before as part of your dossier to get the product approval in China. So you do the clinical studies before you submit the dossier. Let's see here. Let's see. Slide 35 needs clarification. If a device is a non-medical in EU and made in EU, only the non-medical CE mark is possible. However, device could be Class 2 in China. Can this be registered still in China? So the person says on slide 35, you need clarification. If a device is non-medical in the EU and made in the EU, only a non-med CE mark is possible. However, the device could be Class 2 in China. Can this be registered still in China? Well, you have to look at the specific product, but I would say the answer to that is yes. So the next question says, for Class 2 and Class 3 registrations, is it mandatory to get all documentation notarized, notification, copy, and verification of signature? So yes, for Class 2 and 3 product registrations, yeah, the documentation all needs to be notified. Let's see here. On slide 10, you mentioned an alternative pathway for product classification. Could you please elaborate? Well, the alternative pathway for the product classification is you can submit a classification application to the CFDA, and hopefully they'll get back to you within a reasonable time indicating the classification. But as I mentioned during the webcast, the classification process could take anywhere between 3 to 12 months, so it may not be that quickly. Okay, so we have some more questions here. So what are the new clinical trial regulations for Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices? What are the new clinical trial regulations for Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices? Well, as I mentioned in the presentation, according to new regulation, clinical evaluation is required for Class 2 and 3 devices in China today. And the clinical trial for Class 2 and 3 devices can only be waived if the product can meet certain criteria. And those criteria would include things like the working mechanics are clear and the design is definite, and let's say the manufacturer's technology is very mature and has been used in clinics and hospitals around the world for many years without any serious adverse events. You may be able to avoid clinical trials there. If there's some way that you can prove the safety and efficacy of the product, if you can prove that it's safe and efficacious without a clinical trial, then you may not have to do a local clinical trial for your product in China. And I think there's one other one. So again, the other thing is if the safety and efficacy can be proved by an evaluation of a similar product that's on the Chinese market, that may mean you don't have to. You can get the clinical trials waived in China too. Okay. Next question. Can you tell me about new GMP requirements? Can you tell me about new GMP requirements? Well, the revised good manufacturing practice for medical device was, I think, adopted at a working meeting with the CFDA around the end of 2014. I think it was December 2014. And then I think later in the month, in December, the GMP requirements were promulgated. And then I think basically as of this March 1st, 2015, the new GMP regulations will go into effect. So just recently for the new GMP regulations in China. Okay. Next question here is, how can an IVD get into China for a clinical study? How can an IVD get into China for a clinical study? So I guess basically you have a foreign IVD maker and they're trying to get the IVD into China for the clinical study. How do you get the product into the country? I think the only practical way to do that is to put on the label, let's say for the IVD instrument, that the kit, is used for research use only and it's not for sale, and it's only for doing a clinical trial. So I think if you put the label in like this, then your local CRO might be able to clear the product from the Chinese customs as products that are needed for the clinical study. But I think the main thing is you have to put a label on the IVD product that's going to be used in the clinical study, which just says it's for research use only, and then hopefully with your CRO and the local customs people, you can get through that, and then you get the IVD into the country for your clinical study. Next question here says, can we register our IVD without approval in the country of origin? Can we register our IVD without approval in the country of origin? Well, I think for importing and registration of IVDs in China, I don't think you can submit the application to the CFDA without the country of origin approval. But you can keep in mind that the sample testing and the clinical study may be able to start it earlier because these are technical requirements that need to be completed before the submission in China. So you cannot submit your application to the CFDA until you have the country of origin approval for your foreign IVD. But you can begin things like the sample testing and clinical trial, which will be required for the IVD approval in China before you have the country of origin approval. So you can still pick up the pace a little by doing that. Next question, how can we succeed using fast track in China? How can we succeed using fast track in China? Well, as I mentioned, the CFDA recently announced this fast track review process for medical devices and IVD products. But as I mentioned during the webcast, practically speaking, it's really only going to be workable for locally manufactured new products. And the question of is the so-called fast-track approval for imported products, I don't really see it saving that much time from the normal registration process right now. So again, fast-track's approval is okay in China now, but mostly the R&D and some of the manufacturing has to be done in China. And for new products, that fast-track approval could be done, if you're doing the situation in China, if you're making a product in China. Foreign products still having a very difficult time with fast-track approval, and whether that will increase or decrease the time limit for the fast-track approval is still questionable for foreign products. Okay, the next question. What are the requirements for a Class 3 clinical study in China? What are the requirements for a Class 3 clinical study in China? Okay, what are the requirements for a Class 3 IVD clinical study in China? So this focused on IVDs. So let's see. So basically, the Class 3 IVD clinical study in China is going to follow the basic requirements for the Class 3 medical device requirements in China. And again, for IVD products, foreign data and samples cannot be accepted for the local clinical testing. And as I mentioned or shown on one of the slides in the webcast, the Class 3 IVD clinical trial must have a sample size of 1,000 samples. And I think that the clinical trial studying for IVDs in China must have also, besides 1,000 samples, it must be done at least 3 clinical sites. And I know that for IVD clinical trials in China that the study must be conducted by collecting samples from both patients and healthy subjects. I think that was mentioned in the webcast. And, of course, we have this comparison study and the gold standard issue, and how to get your IVD with a comparison with another IVD or some kind of gold standard. That's normally the issue for the local IVD clinical trials. Okay, next question. What is the time frame for straightforward Class 2 import medical device renewal? What is the timeline for a straightforward Class 2 import medical device renewal? Well, that's a good question. What is the time frame for a straightforward Class 2 import medical device renewal? Well, I think the CFDA came out with some new regulations, too, on October 1st, 2004, about the renewal situation. And I think they try to simplify the renewal process for the re-registration. And again, as I mentioned, they said that you should submit 6 months in advance. of the license expiry date, we recommended 12 months. The CFDA, I guess, could complete the review of the application and announce the renewal, approval, or rejection decision, I guess, before the old license expired. So basically, I think I mentioned if the CFDA cannot announce their review and renewal prior to the device expiring, the device registration expiring, the old license can oftentimes be considered a renewal application. I'm sorry. The device, the old license can be considered renewed automatically. So if the CFDA doesn't get to your renewal on time. So here, next question is about the user fees. I think most people trying to register products in China know that the user fees have just gone up tremendously, especially for Class 2 and Class 3 products. And, you can be paying as much for Class 3 products as up to I think it's like $50,000 now to get the approval. Next question. Let's see. Does the CFDA clearance apply to specific software versions on the cleared device? Does the CFDA clearance apply to specific software versions on the cleared device? As subsequent software versions are available, can they be delivered for the cleared device without going through the CFDA, and more specifically, the clinical trial requirements? Okay, so to repeat the question, does the CFDA clearance apply to specific software versions on the cleared device? As subsequent software versions are available, can they be delivered for the cleared device without going through the CFDA, and more specifically, the clinical trial requirements? That's a good question. So I think the answer really depends on the differences between the software versions. Normally if there's a big change in the software, you're going to have to do a new registration, or you're going to have some kind of significant license amendment to your Chinese approval. But keep in mind that some foreign manufacturers will register their software initially as a series of softwares. So they're registering software ABC versions 1 to 10, even though they're only doing version 1 now. Then you should be able to slip the other ones in if the changes are not too significant into the same application. So some manufacturers will include the new software versions as part of the registration renewal applications too, and that could be another way to register the software before the original license expires. But I think the real question is how big a differences are in the different software versions. If they're not too big, if they're very slight, possibly okay. One way to get around that might be registering a series of software products in the beginning so that the CFDA can see that your approval is for versions 1 to 10, not just for version 1. Okay, let's see. Next question. So the next question says, are the CFDA notices about clinical trial exemptions publicly available, and if so, where? Are the CFDA notices about clinical trial exemptions publicly available, and if so, where? Well, I think the exemptions for clinical trials for devices is on the CFDA website, but again, I think it's only in Chinese. Next question, what is type testing and what kind of testing is performed in the CFDA testing centers? Well, the type testing is basically part of the registration. So you have to send samples of your products over to one of the national testing centers, as I mentioned, to be tested. We've seen long delays at the type testing center. And the testing is performed according to your technical requirements that you've given the CFDA to test your product on. Let's see, next question. Regarding Class 2 IVD clinical trial participant sample size of 1,000, Is there a provincial requirement as well? In other words, can we sell our device in all provinces if we conduct our trial in one province? Well, I think if you conduct your trial in one province, you can still use, and then you get the approval. You can still use the approval in other provinces, but in the other provinces, you're going to have to deal with like pricing and reimbursement issues because that's normally on a province-by-province basis. So let's see here. What exactly is the role of the agent in China? What exactly is the role of the agent in China? Well, as discussed before, the legal and the after-sales agent have been combined now. So you have the registration agent and the legal and sales agent, which has been combined. So now there's only 2 agents, whereas in the past there were 3 agents. And as I also mentioned, the agent is responsible for communicating between, the foreign company and the relevant administrative department of the Chinese Health Authority. And also the agent is responsible for truthfully and accurately conveying the Chinese regulations and technical requirements. Again, the agent will collect adverse event reports, which we talked about. The agent can help with product recalls. And, again, the agent can be involved with product quality issues and, let's say, after-sales issues, too. Next question. What can we do if we're unsure about how a product will be classified in China? What's the process like? What can we do if we're unsure about how a product will be classified? So as I mentioned, if the classification is unclear and the foreign company does not want to wait for the CFDA official classification designation, then the company can file the registration applicant immediately as a Class 3 medical device. And then after the CFDA completes their review, they will appoint the proper classification of the product. So if you don't want to wait for the classification by the government, you can apply immediately as a Class 3 device. Of course, that's the most risky. And then after the technical review, the CFDA can alter the classification if need be. Next question. Is the CFDA picky about which? Let's see here. Let's see. Is the CFDA picky about which testing methods are used in product technical specification? Is the CFDA picky about which testing methods are used in product technical specification? Yeah, so the CFDA suggests using the methods described in the Chinese or international standards. And then if the company decides to use their own internal method for the testing, the company must provide the reason or the rationale must be provided. Okay, we got some more questions here. I have a product that's pretty similar in function and safety to one of the products on the Class 2 device clinical trial exemption list. Is there a way for me to add my product to the exemption list or at least expedite the clinical trial phase? I have a product that's pretty similar in function and safety to one of the products on the Class 2 device clinical trial exemption list. Is there any way for me to add my product to the exemption list or at least expedite the clinical trial process? Well, I guess the thing is that the Class 2 or 3 medical device is not included in, I think it was Notice 12 and 13, to be exempted from local clinical trial. And let's say the applicant still feels strongly that the clinical safety can be drawn, let's say, from a previous clinical study or from some usage data from a similarly marketed product in China. Then the applicant can submit a detailed data analysis report to support its argument and apply for the exemption. So that's how you would do it if your specific product is not on the Class 2 or 3 exemption list for clinical trials. Okay, let's see. Next question is, what is the difference between the CFDA GMP requirements and the international U.S. ISO requirements? Well, they're pretty similar. So the ISO certification is required for imported foreign-made devices. Next question. how are device changes controlled in China registrations? Are there significant versus non-significant risk guidances? Is there an abbreviated path for minor changes? Well, yeah, there are in China guidelines to differentiate between changes that require license amendments and then changes that require new registration. And, like, for example, a change to an intended use of the product will almost always require a new registration. Okay, next question. The CFDA guidance, let's see. If a Class 3 product is not specifically exempted for clinical trials but is similar to other commercial products, okay, I think we already went over this. Okay, I think we already went over that question, so let's go to another one. Let's see here. I have so many of them. Is in the occurrence of an adverse event, is it just the product manufacturer and distributor that have to file a report on suspicious medical device adverse events? In the occurrence of an adverse event, is it just the product manufacturer and distributor that have to file a report on suspicious medical device adverse events? See slide 48. I don't think so. I think the answer is for any adverse event. The medical device manufacturer, the distributor, the medical institution, and the CFDA offices are responsible for filing a report, no matter the severity of the adverse event. And so that needs to be reported, not just the manufacturer and distributor, but also the medical institution or hospital, and CFDA offices are also responsible for filing a report. Okay, next question. Are the unannounced CFDA inspections going to be random? Are the unannounced CFDA inspections going to be random? Well, I don't think the CFDA is going to have an unannounced CFDA inspection unless there is a legitimate reason to have the inspection. So I don't think they're just going to go around and do unannounced inspections on randomly chosen facilities. I think that the CFDA team that's going to have an unannounced CFDA inspection needs to prepare documents stating the reason behind the inspection, and also must report the results of the inspection to the manufacturer. So the CFDA team needs to have prepared documents stating the reason before they can do an unannounced inspection. And generally keep in mind that the inspection teams will consist of 2 CFDA officers, either from the national CFDA or also from the local CFDA, the provincial local CFDA offices. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, here's the next question. For registration amendment requirements, what changes are categorized as notification amendment versus a permission amendment? For registration amendment requirements, what changes are categorized as a notification amendment versus a permission amendment? Well, normally, a notification amendment will include, let's say, a change of the legal manufacturer's name or address. Or let's say a notification amendment would be appropriate if there's a change of the agent in China. So that's different than a permission amendment, which is normally geared toward a change of the product model, or let's say there's a change in the product composition or structure, or let's say there's a change in the product technical specifications, or let's say the manufacturing size change. So that would normally be a permission amendment, as opposed to a notification amendment. Okay, listen, we have a lot of more questions, but I think our time's expired. So thank you very much for attending our webcast today. We appreciate it. We hope to see you on another future Pacific Bridge Medical webcast, which we'll announce in the future. Thanks for your attendance again. This is Ames Gross. We appreciate you filling out the evaluation forms, and have a nice day. The webcast is now over. Thank you very much.